What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and in today's video, we begin looking at Unit 9 of the College Board Key Concepts. Unit 9 is 1980 to modern day. To begin Unit 9, we are going to take a look at Ronald Reagan's presidency and specifically the end of the Cold War. Considering the plight of wage earners and the profound and speedy social changes of the 1960s and 1970s, many Americans desired a slowdown. While the 60s and the 70s saw mostly liberal control or action, America was primed for a conservative resurgence in the 1980s. Moderates and many conservatives felt changes should be gradual, and any changes should be allowed time so you could assess the long-term impact. As such, Ronald Reagan and his Vice President George H.W. Bush would together occupy the Oval Office for the entirety of the 1980s, beginning in 1981. In an attempt to combat inflation, Ronald Reagan was a proponent of deregulation and austerity, believing that less regulations and the cutting of federal spending and taxes were necessary for economic growth. Known as the trickle-down theory of Reaganomics, proponents believe tax cuts for individuals, particularly those corporate tax rates, would allow businesses to reinvest in themselves. The businesses would then expand and create more jobs or innovation, i.e. the money would then quote-unquote trickle down, and economic growth would be restored. While the Library of Congress's comprehensive tax history study has discredited this theory, it did not make things worse in regards to inflation and unemployment, but it just made little difference. The primary reason, however, that many of the taxes Reagan and Congress initially cut in the early 1980s were restored was due to an expensive rearming program. Fearing a continuation or the renewal of the conditions brought on by stagflation, many members of the middle class and conservatives supported tax cuts and austerity measures. Many of these middle class voters continue to occupy suburban regions in the Sun Belt, a trend that continued well into the 1980s and 1990s. Ronald Reagan's programs catered to this demographic, emphasizing individualism, smaller government, lower taxes, free enterprise, and deregulation. As a part of his trickle-down economic theory, Reagan proposed a 25% tax cut across 3 years. The policy also called for over $40 billion in cuts on domestic spending, but not military spending. Military spending was actually increased in an effort to reinvigorate the Cold War via an arms race with the Soviet Union. The policy caused the government's debt to soar from 1980 to 1982, resulting in cuts in defense spending, as well as efforts to establish federal employment and social programs in 1983. However, it was a crucial element in orchestrating the fall of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War. During the 1970s, the idea of realpolitik policies of Nixon and Henry Kissinger had resulted in a cooling off period of the Cold War during this era known as détente. Conversely, President Ronald Reagan sought to reinvigorate a heated Cold War. Ronald Reagan's administration and conservative members of Congress vastly increased military spending, an effort to instigate an arms race with the then struggling Soviet Union. By 1985, the U.S. defense budget had more than doubled to $300 billion, and new nuclear weapons were placed in Europe, thus violating the previous SALT agreements. The United States increased its presence around the world by supporting brutal anti-communist regimes in Latin America, as well as CIA activity in Afghanistan meant to supply anti-communist forces against the Soviet military in the Soviet-Afghan War. Reagan also spoke about and funded a missile defense system in space, and increased Cold War rhetoric in speeches deeming the Soviet Union's a, quote, evil empire, and challenging the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev to, quote, tear down the Berlin Wall in 1987. Whether it was intentional or not, the efforts of Ronald Reagan to reinstigate an arms race was a crucial element in the weakening and eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. It should also be noted that during 1991, you are going to see the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall happening in 1989 during the administration of George H.W. Bush. Ronald Reagan's counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, was the first Soviet ruler in 1985 to openly admit that the Soviet Union's socialist economy had been failing. Attempting to improve the economy and political system of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev implemented his perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, openness reforms that adopted more free market economic policies and allowed for more political openness, respectively, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Unable to keep pace with American economic growth and federal spending, the Soviet Union lost its totalitarian grip on Eastern Europe, losing its communist puppet states of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany in the revolutions of 1989. 2 years later, the Soviet Union would break apart and split into many states of Russia, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and others, thus officially ending the communist standoff that propelled the Cold War. Thank you so much for paying attention to this video. If you have not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and do so now. Thank you so much, and have a great day.